The reason I ask everybody whenever I go out, and I'll do prior to COVID, I was doing talks all the time. I was going out, and it came across as if it was, I was just out there speaking at events, but all of it was advocacy work for really the long-term solutions that surround not only gun and gang violence, but also sexual assault and violence and human trafficking and drug addiction and mental health. Pretty much every crime you could think of. And I'll share with you the story to how I got there and why it's important to understand, what part you have to play in the long-term solution. Because the solutions are long-term. And for government, unfortunately, long-term solutions aren't really the focus. For them, it's focusing on what's happening right now and how do we put an end to it. And what I want you to think about now is we've gone through kind of whoever's participating in your class here that's responded to when I asked, what do you want to do when you go forward? And you all kind of give a little bit of a background to what part you want to impact. Everybody said they want to help people, and everybody said they wanted to help people after the fact. So just think about that for a moment. We all want to help people that are victims of crime or that are in the justice system and have been victimized at some point in their life. And now there's a chance of rehabilitation. But all the things that we're aiming at, which are absolutely necessary, are focused on intervention and then getting the person out or getting the help that they need. Where law enforcement comes into play is stopping that from happening from the very onset. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, the way law enforcement has been marketed to people is it is about doing those positive community things. And those things absolutely have value, but they come secondary or tertiary to the very primary things that policing is made up of across the world. In Ontario, the number two things that policing is here for is number one, to protect people and public safety, and number two, to protect your rights, are your Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That's kind of the core essence of what policing is for. All the other things are nice bonus and add-ons. The reason why it's important to remember that we need to protect people and to arrest the bad guys, quote unquote, and the bad girls is because everything that you wanted to do here, everything you spoke about, the real solutions come into those people never being in those positions in the first place. And how I came to understand that and how we came to get here where I'm chatting to you, it's a really long story and I'll try to condense it to not to bore you, but it all kind of started with how I got into policing. So for those of you who are applying, from the age of 19 to 24, I had applied to 6 different police services and I was rejected 5 times. By the time I was 23, I got hired by the Toronto Police Service. And prior to that, I had a million different jobs. I was working at Toys R Us. I was a personal trainer. I'd worked in factories, a car wash, gas stations, random odd jobs, sport check. And then I worked in the entertainment industry in Toronto for 5 years part-time in every major nightclub that you could think of as doorman. So I was invested into, without knowing, organized crime, being particularly the entertainment industry in Toronto. When I became a cop, I quit all of that. I left it all behind me. And I started off in Toronto Police in the west end of the city in 23 Division, which most people know as Rexdale. In my first 5 years there, I'd worked my first year on the road in patrol in a uniform, answering 911 calls. And at that time in 2005, 2006, it was the summer of the gun. There were shootings every day. There were homicides. There was a really bad gang problem in the city, and we were doing what we could. As time progressed, after about 2 years of working on the front line, I had an opportunity to go work as a school resource officer during Toronto. For anybody who remembers, back in 2008, there was this whole big media scrum about officers with cops in schools, and nobody liked it. At least that's the way it was being portrayed. But that was an oxymoronic thing to say. Officers with guns. Well, it's Canada. All cops have guns. Us being in schools, the primary purpose wasn't to go out there and to arrest kids. It was to really engage some of the kids, especially the troubled ones, to provide an alternative path as well as be an adult role model for them. During my time there, I was in a school called North Albion Collegiate Institute. I'd asked for that school, and the reason I asked for that was it was one of the most violent schools at the time. To give you an idea of how violent it was, across the street from it is a known gang area known as Mount Olive. It's been a historical gang problem in the city of Toronto since the early 90s. There were 17 drive-by shootings the month before school started. When I got in there into the school, I noticed there was a huge gap for extracurricular programming, in particular football. And I had about 80 kids over the course of 6 months that were all at-risk kids that were looking for something to belong. And over the course of a year, we managed to raise enough money to start a football team, which I maintained to coach for a couple of years. After 2 years as a school resource officer, I left. I went in for about 6 months as what's called a criminal investigative bureau, where you go out and you investigate certain crimes that can range from assaults, threats, break and enter sometimes, to a variety of other offenses. After a few months of that, I'd gone out to what was called TAVIS at the time. For those of you who remember, TAVIS was a very proactive approach to dealing with gun and gang violence, but I'd done it locally in Rexdale. After working in the divisional circuit, I decided to go to what I call our Glass Palace. It's our headquarters. It's where everybody is, the chief of police, the deputy chiefs, all the senior officers. It's like the central body for all of Toronto. I'd worked in there for 2 years, creating and facilitating educational components and training for all the school resource officers service-wide, as well as I was a liaison point between all the school boards and the Toronto Police Service, being the public board, the Catholic board, the French board, and the English board. So I was the intake guy. I got to know a bunch of people in the school system, and I got to really understand what's happening in the education system. After 2 years of that, I decided to reset my career. I went back to the front lines and I went to a division called 14 Division, which is Parkdale. It's considered the flagship division in Toronto Police, and that's kind of why I went there. It's considered one of the best divisions to work at because the output there is so high and it's so busy that if you were to thrive in that environment, you're good anywhere. So I went back to the road for 6 months. I left. I went to a specialized unit called Major Crime Vice Unit in 14 Division, where we really focused on drug work, break and enters, robberies, shootings, and a wide variety of other very serious offenses. After that, I'd gone to the Gun and Gang Task Force, which is exactly what you think it's going to be. It's just like the movies. You work in a small team. You have many informants on the street. They call you up. They give you information in regards to guns, gangs, and drugs. And then our job is kind of like a plainclothes, kind of undercover, but not really undercover unit, is to get out there and to go and to find these bad people and do search warrants and do surveillance on them and get all these guns and put them before the justice system. I did that for about 2 years and it totally burnt me out. I'd pushed so hard in my policing careers in my first 10 years because I wanted to prove so much. I mean, I got rejected so many times that I really wanted to prove to myself and to everybody else who rejected me in a real egomaniac way that, look, I was the best person for this job. So I'd accomplished a lot of great things in my first 10 years, but it cost me a lot. It cost me being away from my family, being away from my kids. It was really taking a toll on my mental health, but I was lucky enough to recognize it and I pulled out. And when I pulled out on great terms with the people I had worked with. I was very forthcoming and honest with them. And when I said, guys, I need a reset, I left and I went back to the streets. And where I went back to was Rexdale. That was home for me. It was a rough spot, but I had started there. I had known a lot of people there. And for me to kind of go back and slow down a little bit, it was the perfect spot. But within 6 months of being there was this idea that began to float in Toronto Police Service. And it was from our current chief. His name is Jim Raymer. At the time, he was a deputy chief. So he was like the number 2 in command. And the idea was, well, how do we get a gang member out of a gang? And as things had funneled down, they were kind of looking for somebody to participate in this and figure out this problem. Well, they'd known my background, kind of where I grew up, the jobs I had before, the positive community things I did, as well as the really hard enforcement things. And I was asked if I wanted to participate in kind of trying to figure out how to get a gang member out of a gang. The very first thing we had to do is kind of figure out, well, has anybody else done this before? And we found out that in British Columbia, there's a provincial unit called endganglife.ca, which works out of a really long titled unit, which I won't even get into. And they were actively pursuing this since 2013. I'd gone over to Vancouver. I'd spent a couple of days with them to see what they're doing, and we learned a lot. And they're great guys, and they've been a huge help for me going forward. But I'd come back to Toronto, and one of the things I really learned at the time was gun and gang violence. It's only become a problem for major cities in the world when shootings start happening in places they aren't supposed to happen. And just think about that sentence in itself. You know, in this day and age, everybody talks about equality and social justice. Well, this particular issue here was a highlighting point and feature for me. Why was a highlighting point and feature was, if there are shootings that happen, and I want you to think for yourself now, you don't have to answer this, you don't have to participate, but be honest with yourself and think about it. If you wake up in the morning tomorrow and you see a shooting and you look up and it says Jane and Finch or Rexdale or Black Creek and Eglinton or Scarborough or Malvern or anywhere else where you suspect gang activity to be doesn't really invoke an emotional response, because most people think, well, that's where shootings are supposed to happen. But when shootings happen in places they aren't supposed to happen, such as Eaton Center, other high affluent areas, other jurisdictions, well, now it becomes a problem and people have to do something about it. Well, that in itself is a problem, because there should be zero tolerance with gun and gang violence, sexual assault and violence, and human trafficking, regardless of where it happens. But those ideas kind of get socialized in. And we started to see this huge picture, right? And the bigger picture was, and I'll summarize it to you as best as I can, we found many academic publications when it came down to identifying, well, who is a gang member, right? So usually if this is in person, we get in a full conversation, but it's really tough over Zoom. But I'll just share to you kind of the experiences that we had. So I would go out to different rooms and I would advocate for this. And I would advocate in a different way. And I would say, okay, I want you to describe to me what a gang member is. And everybody would give me an answer. And I want you to think now what you think that answer would be. So if I went to different areas of the city, if I went to Jane and Finch, Rexdale, Blackbeak, Eglinton, or I went to Yorkville, I went to, some of the higher affluent areas, and I'd come in to speak to different organizations and groups to solve this problem. And I said, I want you to describe a gang member to me, because we're going to go and save their life. I want you to think the type of person that they would describe to me. And the person you're thinking of is what everybody described. Everybody described a young Black male living in a neighborhood, and they dressed a certain way, regardless of if the population that I was speaking to was a Black population or non-Black population or brown or Asian or East Indian or something. It did not matter. That was the idea that they had. Well, in reality, that's not the case. Gang members make up every different nationality, and they make up both sexes. They don't belong to a certain group, but they belong to certain different things. And those things that they belong to are risk factors. So we had found an objective base to identify a gang member, because you have to think, as a government organization, we can't just arbitrarily choose a group and say, this is the group we're going to work with. In most cases, sometimes groups come to law enforcement and say, look, we have a problem in our community. It's deep rooted in cultural issues. It's deep rooted from a lack of different things. And we really want to help with the solution, but we don't know how to solve this. And then we'll go in and work with them. But in this particular case, what we realized was that's not the case. We have statistics and arrests of gang members, and they come from every different nationality. None of it makes sense. But we had to find a real academic lens, an objective lens, to say, well, what is the stuff that we're missing? And what we did find was risk factors. Now, over the course of 0 to 18, there are 36 different risk factors that impact everybody. But if they go unmitigated, if there's nothing to check the balance out, well, the likelihood of this person becoming a gang member exponentially grow over time. Now, those 36 risk factors, I won't go over them with you now in depth, but I'll break it down to 5 stages of life. And I want you to think for yourself and for the people that you know that are involved in guns and gangs, because we all at some point know somebody who's involved criminally. I want you to think about the person that you're dealing with or that you know, and see what part of their life applies to this. And I'll share with you an example of some of the people we've had success with getting out of the lifestyle. So the first category is your family. The risk factors in your family all have to do with what you would traditionally think would happen. A broken family home, parent criminality, economic opportunities that don't exist, a single parent home, just an incurred amount of debt, and really some parent who's not around all the time. Generally speaking, you have all these risk factors in there. Now, that respect, we don't know what's happening in a household for somebody between the ages of 0 to 6. But where we do see them is in the next category, which is education or school. So in your family from 0 to 6, you develop all these innate behaviors and thought processes. And those thought processes actually cement themselves in a little bit of stone. They're not impossible to work with, but they start to really develop who you are. And I want you to think about this. We think that 0 to 6 people are absorbing information. They are, but they're absorbing information not to succeed in life, but they're absorbing information to survive. And for that type of person, to them to survive, sometimes the behavior is violent, it's aggressive, it's very self-centered, and it's very focused on them, because the luxuries of what we have in terms of resources like food, love, attention, they're very scarce. So when they get it, they want all of it. They have no idea how to share. Now this person ends up in school. And what we see in school is we see a low attachment to education, see a low attachment to school, we see disruptive behavior. We see kids as young as in kindergarten failing current curriculum, but they get pushed through. And from family 0 to 6, your school is from 6 to 9. That's the big one, or 6 to 15, I should say. Well, after that, once you become about 9 years old, well, it becomes your friends. It's your peer group. And your peer group impacts you from 9 to 15. And 9 to 15 is a critical age, especially in Toronto and major cities. It's because of the density of living. If you're in the suburbs, people live house to house to house. But if you live in a major city, you live on top of each other. It's just the way it goes. You have buildings and people live on top. Well, what is your background in a building, or what is your backyard in a building? It's your lobby, it's your elevator, it's your stairwells, it's the back parking lot. Well, when these kids are 9 years old, generally they've been problematic in both school and at home. Well, the second they've developed a peer group, the parents will say things like, go outside and play with your friends, get out of the house, but they go unsupervised. And from 9 to 15 within the peer group, we start to see things happen criminally. They start to get arrested for small things. They start to get reported as missing kids by their parents. They start to get caught for shoplifting. They sometimes become victims of crime. And then things slowly escalate to them as an individual. An individual tends to hit them between the age of 12 and 15. So 0 to 6 is your family. 6 to 15 is your school. 9 to 15 is your peer group. And then 12 to 18 is you as an individual. So think for yourself, when you're 12 years old, you hit puberty around then, and then you start to really develop a sense of self, like, who am I? And oftentimes kids will go through different cycles, but they really start to figure out, well, who am I and what do I want to be? And it's in that age range that they start to develop themselves as an individual. And if any of those negative behaviors don't get checked going forward, or they're not mitigated with positive things, their path is kind of destined. And that's an unfortunate truth. But by the time they're 18, it hits the last risk factor. So 0 to 6 is your family. 6 to 15 is your school. 9 to 15 is your peer group. 12 to 18 is you as an individual. And then 18 and up becomes the community. But now there's recent studies that say, you know what, it's not actually 18 and up, it's 15 and up. And how it impacts your community, it impacts it through violence. So you'll see access to drugs, access to guns, gang normalization, criminal normalization. All of those things combined set somebody on a path where then they become incarcerated, or they become victims of crime, or they end up being a murderer. And that's just the truth to it. So once we had developed an idea of what are the type of people we should be looking for, we also figured out what are the behaviors we should be looking for, and what is the history among not only police, but different stakeholders, being different government institutions. So between that life cycle of 0 to 18, I want you to think about all of the government institutions that person has interaction with, and at what point it could be recognized. 0 to 6, unless it's really bad, no government institution is knowing what's happening. But in most of our cases, if not all of the cases, with a certain portion of the population, they're living in community housing. Now, it's a low income. It's not community housing that's the problem. It's the income disparity that's the problem there. So they have no economic outlook. So the parents are often working 2 jobs or 3 jobs, and they're unsupervising their kids. So it increases their risk. Now, in there, we have community housing. They might have a better insight to what's happening. And then they go to school, and you have the Ministry of Education, and you have the individual school boards, depending on where they're at. Well, they absolutely know what's going on, because they are the primary caregivers during regular daytime hours. And they intimately know the kids, because they're getting paid to teach these kids, spend time with them, and build relationships. So they're recognizing all these risk factors as time goes on. But what do schools do? And it's not to their fault. Teachers are amazing people. I love teachers. But what happens is they get frustrated. They have 30 kids in the class. There's one kid that's absolutely disruptive. They isolate the kid. They put him in a special class. And I want you to think about what class this kid ends up with. What are the other students like? They're just like him or her. So they're also suffering the risk factors, but now you've developed this peer group. And as they continue to go on, they're unsupervised, they get out there, and they get groomed and recruited in. So we had a good idea of what was happening with these kids, and we had started to really develop a picture. Well, the first part was identifying, well, who do we go after? Who do we engage? And the second part was, where do we go in the city? Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the city of Toronto, in 2015, the city of Toronto was split up into 140 neighborhoods, and they were split up by equity scores. So the city had done this grid and said, look, we're going to look at a couple factors, and we want to take things into consideration, such as the average median income of a home, what the parental household look like, or the family structure look like, what is their access to economic opportunity, what is their access to transportation, and how does the community feel like they have a voice in the development of their community. And they developed these scores. while 31 of the city's 140 neighborhoods were below an acceptable threshold. They've been deemed neighborhood improvement areas. And as of 2020, the city of Toronto has invested millions of dollars to bolster these neighborhoods up. But the way they bolstered them up is through programming and supports. And their idea was to bring these neighborhoods back to an acceptable level or an equal level on the playing field. Now, if I were to take those 31 neighborhoods and I were to take our police intelligence and tell us where all the active violent gangs are, they go hand in hand. That's not by accident. There is a huge connection and correlation between poverty and criminal activity. It's called social disorganization, and it's a theory from the 1940s. And it's much deeper than that, but that's the low-hanging way of explaining it. It's not to say that people are poor and being poor results in criminal activity. It's not to say that. It's the history behind how this happened and what tools people have to overcome the economic disparity. Now, think about this. There's families in Toronto that I have really good relationships with that have been third generation housing. So their parents were in community housing and their grandparents were in community housing. And I know all three generations. And when I've spoken to these families and I said, how did you end up here? None of them were given the educational knowledge on how to break this cycle. They don't understand interest rates. They don't understand how to develop credit. They don't understand what equity means. They've been given no tools to how to break the cycle. Instead, they get supplemented with programming. And the programming doesn't necessarily work all the time. So for example, if a family can't feed themselves, they should be given some sort of aid to help develop food or to acquire food to feed themselves and take that pressure off of them. But at the same time, we should be applying some other solutions to let's get you aligned with a mentor in a place of employment that you would excel in and that you would enjoy. Let's also get you connected with some access to economic opportunities. Let's really harness our partnerships to bring in some of the private sector to get you out of the cycle. And let's give you the educational knowledge for you to pass on to your kids. Instead, we don't see that. What we do see is just the continual cycle of reliance on other people. And that tends to be a very big problem. Now, when you have kids that are growing up in this type of system and in this environment, the cycle won't break unless they're presented a different option. But what we do see is a huge option for drug distribution. And that's because of, in a weird way, victimization. Now, what is the main purpose of gangs? All right. So we know the risk factors that makes a gang member. We know the areas to look at. And then this became the part, well, what's the purpose of a gang? How do they find people and what do they do? Well, academically speaking, a gang only serves three purposes. The first purpose is to deal drugs. That's what they do. The drug market is a huge, huge market. It is a multi-billion-dollar market. The second thing to do is they collect debt. All right, so they deal drugs. They also need to collect debt. And I want you to think of the methods that they collect debt. All right, they're going to do it through violence. Unfortunately, gangs don't have an HR system. So if there's an internal problem or an external problem, they can't go and complain to their HR manager. They have to enact violence because violence is the equal opportunity regulator. And the more violent you are, the higher you kind of move. The more connected you are, the better you are off in the organization of being a gang member. But then the third thing that they do is they collect debt. All right, so we have deal drugs. Sorry, third thing they do is not collect debt. It's number one is they deal drugs. Number two is they collect debt. Number three is they need to control a territory. So they have a certain block. And if you have any sort of business acumen or a business background, I want you to think of this. If you're going to open a restaurant, let's say you want to open a McDonald's. One thing McDonald's will do is they'll look in the area and say, well, you can't open a McDonald's within another 2 kilometers of another McDonald's because it's bad for business. They don't want to have 2 McDonald's offering the same service competing with each other because it'll just divide any of the money. It doesn't make any economic sense. Gangs look at it the same way. They have to control certain territories, and certain territories need to be controlled by certain gangs to distribute drugs because of the high amount of profits onto it. Now, why drugs in that area? Well, let's take a look back when you guys were mentioning mental health and wellness. The families of gang members, as well as gang members themselves, are riddled with PTSD, trauma, anxiety, and depression, riddled with it. They're on level 10 all the time. They are absolutely distrusting, and rightfully so. Many of them by the age of 15 have seen homicides or participated in shootings, have been abducted, have been victims of serious violent crimes. So their outlook on life is a very violent and a very short one. And sometimes that becomes one of the biggest issues is they don't think about life when they're 40 years old or 50 years old. For them, that doesn't exist. They are happy if they just wake up tomorrow. Because they're so short-sighted in their lifespan, they do very risky things because the repercussions of going to jail don't really apply to them. It doesn't matter to them if you tell them you're going to go to jail for 12 years, because as far as they're concerned, they're not going to live to 12 years. They would rather make a couple $1,000s in the day through drug distribution and other victimization and ever be turned off from the idea of having to deal drugs and get out there, or sorry, and go to jail. Um, that being said, where we really had our success, and I'm really condensing this for you because it's really tough over Zoom. But that being said, we did have a lot of success, and the success came from a lot of different things. Once we realized this big picture, we actually did infield work. So for about 3 years, I had done all the gang exit strategy myself personally, one-on-one with the gang members. We had about 80 gang members or people involved in human trafficking. And outside of academic studies, I'll tell you the real world application of it. 50% of the people I was dealing with initially were males, and 50% were females. The males were all recruited in by older gang members, and they were all starting off with the same offenses. They were recruited in as young as 8 years old, and we have video of this that we weren't allowed to release. But they were recruited in because these kids loitering at the age of 9 in their peer group risk category factor were being recruited in not by guys that were 30 or 40 years old, but by guys that were 16 years old, 17 years old. So we had kids recruiting kids. And why they were recognized is because this 16-year-old was that 12-year-old 4 years ago. So he recognized the behavior and the opportunity of somebody who's looking for something. Generally speaking, a positive adult role model and a way to acquire things. I mean, for these kids going to school, sometimes the gang members, they're going to schools and everybody around them has cell phone, clean clothes, they got food, they can go on school trips. These guys and girls have nothing. So what they end up doing is they want a lot more than what they can get. When somebody provides them that income opportunity and a little bit of support and guidance and some positive words and a sense of belonging, they're kids, they take right to it. Everybody wants that. Even adults want it. So they get re-victimized by other people. As they get brought in, they start to move up the chain and they have to do more and more violent things, which puts a higher price on their head, as well as puts a lot more trauma on them as they go forward. So the guys that we had all kind of fit the same bill. The girls, on the other hand, were brought in very, very differently. Out of the 40 girls we had, about 30 of them were brought in through human trafficking. All right, they were being groomed by these gang members to provide the one thing that these guys could not, and it was sex. And they were underage. They were being groomed by underage people, and they were in this cycle, and they were volunteering because of the same issues. They had very different risk factors. They looked at life very differently, but they were being used for this primary purpose of sex trafficking. And they were almost complicit and compliant in it. So it became very difficult to prosecute or have them flip. It was a hard thing to do because there was a lot of things over their head. One, they'd commit very indecent acts, very personal acts with complete strangers. Every interaction they had with somebody was a victimized interaction. And I want you to imagine you're a victim or a survivor of human trafficking, and now you have to testify in court against the person that did this to you, and you're open to cross-examination, as well as you need to really get into detail to what happened. It's absolutely embarrassing. It's disempowering, and there's no way around it right now. I know the court systems are trying to figure it out, but it becomes a completely traumatic experience all over again. And oftentimes, because our court's so delayed, you're looking at having to relive this after 3 years of it. So the arrest happens today. It's not for 3 years for you to come forward. And because it's not a tangible offense, meaning that there's nothing we can seize as evidence besides text messages and other types of physical evidence, there's nothing like when you steal a chocolate bar from a grocery store. I can't say this was the chocolate bar you stole when it comes down to sex offenses. I have to have somebody testify to them being a victim. Now, for them to do that, it's absolutely heroic when they do it, but it's next to impossible to encourage somebody to want to do that without telling them that, look, it's going to be tough for you. We don't want to lie to people. So we had 50% males, 50% females, all of them under the age of 18. And then we expanded out. And how we expanded out was we spent 6 months educating 2,000 frontline officers. And we said to the frontline guys and girls, look, if you come across a kid or anybody who fits the bill of these risk factors, here's a checklist, have them fill it out. If you have a positive relationship with them, I want you to pitch the product that we have, being gang exit. So these coppers would go out, they would pitch this product, and then they would send us all this stuff in an email fashion. And then I'd vet it. And I'd go through a bunch of different things. And then we'd make contact with the person within 24 hours. Well, we managed to hit a home run because for a lot of these guys and girls, majority of them under the age of 21, which was a huge eye opener for us, we'd seen a lot of different stuff in the data. And I'll share with you the data. So between August of 2020 and May of 2021, our program went from 40 people to 800 people. To break down the statistics on you, 88% of those people were male, 12% were, sorry, 75% of those were male, 25% of them were female. 88% of them were people between the ages of 18 and 21. 2% were less than the age of 12, and the rest made up the category of 13 to 17. And the reason why that's so important was we saw that the people that were most receptive to any sort of exit opportunity, any sort of intervention or prevention, were actually adults. It was people over the age of 18. In 2018, we conducted what's called a gap analysis. We wanted to really look at what the social services in Toronto were doing and where the gaps were and how we could support it. Because all of these people, the help that they needed, it wasn't from policing that they needed the help. They needed help from mental health professionals, economic specialists, other type of service-minded people. Cops were not designed for that, but we had this massive intake. So in this gap analysis, what we realized was if you are a male over the age of 18 in Toronto and you're getting out of jail, there is absolutely nothing for you. You're stuck, you're on your own. Meanwhile, on our gang exit intake, who was our predominant people? 75% were males over the age of 18 that had an abundance of risk factors. Yet we asked ourselves the question, well, why do people reoffend? And the simplest thing is to go after the low-hanging fruit. So people will blame the police, they'll blame the criminal justice system, they'll blame everybody else except for the core root causes of it, which is how do we create healthy people and how do we create healthy families to prevent all of this from happening in the first place? And here we get into this weird conundrum, right? So you want to help people, and you don't want there to be any victims. But what we do as individuals and as people is we find our camps. So here, for example, some of our camps in this conversation is police-minded, right? We want to be a police officer, we're going to solve all these problems. Some of them have to do with working in the criminal justice system as a corrections officer or a youth probation officer. And we think that's the way. Now, all of it is the way, but all of it is the way together. The hardest part is to get all of us on the same page because we're so hard-headed as individuals. We are so passionate about our causes that we only focus on ours. And the idea of the advocacy work and getting out and talking to people is to say, look, man, you got to peel it back sometimes and say, what you have absolutely is important to offer. And if you care about it, go after it 150%. But so is the person beside you, regardless of how you feel about that. Because these 36 risk factors, no one agency, organization, or person can solve it. It's next to impossible. It's asking so much from one person that it's impossible to do. What you actually need is absolute partnerships among all levels of government, as well as the private sector. That is how you solve a lot of the problems. And we frameworked it in 4 different ways. Number one is education. All right. Number one is educating people on this is the problem and this is where the solutions lie in. Everybody wants to hear about the problem because it drives people to want to do something. But what's even better to add into it and what's more valuable is adding in to say, you know what, here's the solutions we can employ and let's be open-minded about the solutions. Are we going to get it perfect every time? No. But it's important to do it, to track it, to monitor it, and share your results, which generally speaking, no organization does really well in the government space. We don't really track our results really well or share information extremely well where it matters, being at the grassroots municipal level. The second thing we got to add in is prevention. So how do we prevent these young kids from 0 to 18 from going in this lifespan? Well, what we need to do is we need to engage and get all the stakeholders on board, and we need to educate them on the risk factors as well as the solutions to the risk factors. How do we mitigate these type of things? And if this was in person, what I do is in most people is I give you all the survey that we give to these gang members, and you'd be surprised how many police officers score extremely high on these surveys. So the difference became, or the question became, well, what makes a police officer who scores really high on the gang risk factors a cop, and somebody else who scores just as high a criminal? Well, it had to do with mitigating factors. So for myself, I was lucky to have coaches, to have parents, to have siblings, people who cared enough to stop me when I was doing something stupid, and people who I cared enough about or looked up to enough to really set a good blueprint and a guideline for me. Well, for this portion of the population, being both the victims of gun and gang violence and human trafficking, as well as the perpetrators, the actual gang members themselves, they didn't have any of that. Their role models, their incentives were criminal, absolutely criminal in nature. And when we look back at all of them, there's always areas somebody could have intervened or prevented this from happening. And generally, it's another stakeholder group in government really stepping up to the plate and working together to do it. So you have education, number one, you have prevention, number two. Number three is intervention. And this part never gets talked about enough. And this is where policing and a lot of the work that you guys and girls are getting into have to do with things. So for example, the intervention component is, well, what do we do about people who've been victimized and are in the system through victim services? And what do we do about those that are incarcerated? You can't just put people in prison and expect the problem to solve. They need rehabilitation. And one of the questions I ask a lot to different parts of the justice sector all over the world is I say, well, what does the path to redemption looks like? And I want you to think about that. So just think about that question there. I'll go and I'll speak to governments in different countries or different police organizations or courts. And one of the opening questions I ask when we talk to them on the enforcement side is I always ask them, I said, well, what does the path to redemption look like? And we try to spark a conversation. And to this day, we don't have a definitive answer. And what the path to redemption means is, let's say, for example, there was somebody who was, when they were 16 or 17 or 18, they committed some minor crimes, nothing too crazy. And as life progressed, they were in their 30s and they said, well, I want to be a police officer. How long do we hold that history against them for? And there's really no right answer to it. There's no one definitive answer, but it's a question that should be thought of to say, all right, well, how long are we going to hold somebody's past against them from pursuing something else in the future? And that's an absolutely essential thing to ask. And that kind of sits in the intervention space. It's figuring out, well, what do we need to prove and what do we need to do to be able to prove that this person who isn't what they were? So you have education, prevention, intervention, and the very last piece, which is absolutely critical for law enforcement, is suppression, which means how do we find the people doing this? Without question, the number one deterrent of crime is to increase the fear of getting caught. That's all it is. It's as simple as that. It's academically proven that if you can heighten the fear of getting caught, people will do less bad behavior. And I'm not just talking criminally. I'm talking about those people who might even cheat on their spouse. Let's look at every negative behavior you could think of. What's most likely to prevent you from doing that? Increasing your chance of getting caught. If you're going to cheat on your boyfriend, girlfriend, whoever, if your chances of getting caught are going to be high, you're probably not going to do it. But if you reduce that and you minimize that, well, people are going to start taking riskier and more criminal behavior because they're not going to get caught. They're not going to face the repercussion. And for policing, a lot of it has been marketed and branded. And like I said, where it's like, yeah, go after, mentor kids. And look, I've spent a ton of my life in a lot of different things. So to do a little segue and to come back into this where I really stand on suppression, being going after the bad people, holding them accountable, doing the investigations, really finding them and putting the core percent of them that need to be put in jail. It's based off of a lot of different things, but it's based off of this. Look, I've been a cop or in law enforcement for 18 years. I've been volunteering in different capacities for over 20. To this day, I still volunteer. I still actively coach at-risk kids and kids, as well as I sit on a bunch of different boards and committees, all volunteer. I don't get paid for any of it, but I care a lot about it because for me, if I didn't have coaches growing up and positive adult role models, I have no doubt in my mind I would end up on that side like a lot of my friends did. But I value so much of it that it's a big part of me and I'll do it till the day I die. And the benefit of getting involved outside of just policing or whatever and volunteering and getting yourself on some high level boards and really doing grassroots stuff is you see a bigger picture. And the bigger picture is there are absolutely good people out there. And we cannot at any point put the offender's rights over the victim's rights. We can't do that. If somebody does something bad to somebody, and I understand there's people in jail who absolutely need help, but for policing, our focus for those who want to be a police officer should always be about catching those that do crime. That's it. It's the number one focus. Outside of that, then we can step back and say, how can we help these people? And that's what we should be doing. We should be asking, once we arrest them and hold them accountable, well, what are the places we could mitigate this? What are the agencies we can connect them with? What are the risk factors that need to be mitigated? Because the reality is, it isn't just the gang risk factors that make these type of people. It's not just gang members that suffer from it. It's everybody, every major crime in the world, not only on the criminal end, but the victim end. It's these risk factors on all of them that need to be addressed at the very root cause. And until we get together and do that, we're going to see both victim and offender nonstop. But again, for policing, suppression is the absolutely most important. One of the things that when I'll go out and I'll really advocate for policing importance on social issues is to say, look, all of these programs are fantastic. And if they can be proven to help, and that's the keyword, proven to help, we should support it. But just throwing programs at social problems, if it's not a safe environment, will never work. People won't come out and participate if it's not safe. I mean, to this day, we're seeing repeated daytime shootings. I mean, just in the last 2 years, we've had innocent people killed, absolutely innocent people killed, but we're still throwing stuff at it thinking it's going to solve that problem. If the people doing the killing aren't held accountable or stopped, it doesn't set a good precedence for everybody. Bad guys and bad girls need to understand that I can't just show up to a neighborhood and kill anybody and walk away from it. They just can't. It'll never work. And until that gets established in the really worst areas, we can't establish any sort of success with any sort of intervention or prevention programs. It just doesn't work. And I've looked at this globally. I looked at 610 programs in the United States, and what we found was a very minimal amount, I'd probably say less than 5%, showed any promise of effectiveness. And the core commonality was the criminals still ran the show in the neighborhood. They were still dealing drugs, collecting debt, victimization, and controlling a territory. And until we could dismantle that as law enforcement, we were just banging our head against the wall for feel-good initiatives. Feel-good initiatives being to take the social media picture to post it up there to say, look at what we're doing, when in reality, you haven't done anything. When there's kids getting shot and killed in the city of Toronto or any other major city, and you have, people in positions of authority to be able to do something about it, and instead they're taking pictures with different organizations, that to me is a lost cause. They need to aggressively go after it. Just to summarize it, why I'm so passionate about it is I know these families, I know these people that are victims of gun and gang violence on the human trafficking side and the murder side. And it's terrible what's happened to these families, and they have absolutely no voice in this. And if you're going to choose to be a police officer, what I'd recommend to everybody, and even all the young officers I work with now, is to stay focused to that cause. Stay focused to the cause of, we need to keep people safe. And how do we do that? We find the most violent people, we build a case, and we put them before the courts. After the fact, then we go in and we start building up relationships. Then we go in and we start helping these people. But you need all of it, not just any of it. So while I focus and I harp on the police aspect of it, it's because it's the aspect I'm from. But I have a tremendous amount of respect and value for agencies like Children's Aid, Ministry of Community and Children's Safety, for the court system, for the school system, for social services. We need all of it to come into play, but we don't need to all do each other's job. Let the police do the police's job. Let social services do theirs. Let probation do their job. Let criminal justice do their job. And we support each other and value each other. And once we can do that, we can actually come together and start to put not only a dent in crime, but we can help a lot of people that absolutely need the help. I'm sorry if I went really quick there, but I have to close off with that to remind people in this room that what you're chasing after is absolutely important for you and your lens. But you should always keep in mind that the person beside you who's looking at this problem a little different, they're not less than you, they're not greater than you, but they're an essential partner to bring to the table. And if you're really in this business to help people, you need to find what your role is, do your role better than anybody else, and anybody else who's supporting the big picture to help people, bring them on board, build those relationships, and value everybody. That being said, I'll open it up to any questions you guys have about anything that I've said or any other issues. And by all means, you can ask me, and if I can answer it, I'll answer it wholeheartedly. Thanks, Frank.
Yeah, so I'll just I'll just do a bit of commentary before we open it up, because I think this is absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for those heartfelt. I mean, and this is true life experience that you're listening to. This is someone that's gone right from the beginning and where he is today and what he's trying to do, which is really to help everyone. So I can't thank him enough for taking his personal time to do this. He's on a day off, and he agreed to come and do our classes. So I completely respect, and I have a lot of respect for this man. I just wanted him, I just wanted to tease out from him, like, this guy, you see that face? Eh? He doesn't look like a face you want to mess around with, right? Like, does anybody in this class agree? Like, I look at this face over here and I'm thinking, that's somebody in the laneway. And you've heard me talk about the laneway, eh? The stereotypical threats, we call it. This guy's got a serious side to him. You know why? He was a real master MM fighter. Like, this is the real deal you got here. And can you just tell the class just a little bit about that part of your life? Because you were right in the trenches there when you actually started all this.
Yeah, it's a long personal story, but I'll share it with you guys here. So when this all happened, so this whole gang exit stuff, it happened at a real critical time for me in my life. It was, I was burnt out from policing, absolutely burnt out from the job, because the job will do it from you. And I was frustrated because I didn't know where the answer was anymore. Like most people here, I got into this profession because I wanted to really have an answer to big problems. And in the course of my policing career, I connected with both victims of crime and criminals. I had an affinity towards the bad guys, right? The real broken people. They were my people because the reality is I like everybody else who you'll hear this all the time, never came from a perfect background at all. I mean, it was a really rough time growing up, a very violent time growing up, filled with a lot of bad things. But I managed to overcome because of the people around me that believed in me. My high school teacher said a few good things to me. My friend said a few good things to me. And it's always the small things I stuck onto that kind of got me to where I got to. But in January 2017, when this kind of opportunity popped up to come in here and start Toronto's gang exit program, I was already all into it. And my childhood best friend growing up, like we were inseparable from grade 6. He had, like a movie, taken a completely separate route. So I'd gone the law enforcement route. He'd gone the real criminal organized crime route. And we had kept in touch, but we knew our limitations with each other well. Unfortunately, in January 2017, I started this. And in February 2017, he was arrested after discarding a dismembered body. And then he committed suicide in jail. And at his funeral, when I had gone there, I had reconnected with about 300 or 400 guys that we all grew up together with, and his network had grown criminally. And I was the only cop there. And I had known everybody because we all grew up together. So it wasn't like they knew who I was, but when I'd come in, I was pissed off. I wanted to find out what happened because he had become, from what we heard, a really violent guy. He was really involved with a very different organized crime, and just word on the street was he'd become a hitman. But I didn't know him like that. I knew him as a grade 6 kid, and it really drove me to say what happened here. So everything kind of happened for me coming in, where I was frustrated with policing, with just seeing the nonstop cycle of things. I had an opportunity to really solve a big problem, being how do we get a gang member out of gang? And then my childhood best friend was now dead as a result of this stuff. And I'm not excusing anything he did. He did some very terrible things. But when I tried to get answers through even that group to what happened, nobody gave me an answer. And I was so frustrated. Actually, people said, drop it, stop asking questions. You don't even know. And to this date, that homicide that he was involved in hasn't been solved. So it was a very serious thing. And as that went on, Frank, you mentioned all the other kind of things I got involved with. Look, it's individual. It's up to everybody else, like the benefit of coming from really a place that's not the best. And this is kind of what I have my own version of this. So sometimes I'll hear sob stories all the time, and they are sob stories to me, right? And some people have legitimate ones where I'm like, holy crap, I have no idea how you woke up today. And for other people, I'm like, this is not a big deal. Like, you got to relax, you got to chill out, you got to take a breath. Well, for me, I always looked at opportunities to challenge myself, to really push myself. So as Frank had mentioned, man, I don't take anything for granted. I'm naturally a very aggressive person, but I had to channel that into certain channels. So one of those channels became martial arts, a bunch of different martial arts, and MMA. So in 2014, I became a 2-time world champion in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, submission grappling in Texas. Competed at the world level. And in 2012, I had won North American championship. And then I transitioned out after that, and I got a few MMA fights where I went undefeated. But all that tied into on the job stuff. What got me into that was I had about 6 months on the job, and I was always a tough guy. All right, like I'd been in a bunch of street brawls, and my first fight was before kindergarten. I remember being maybe 4 years old, and I was in a tennis court playing ball hockey, and my older brother, ended up telling his buddy, "My brother's stronger than yours." And he was actually my friend, and we got in a full out scrap when we were like 4. And it was the beginning for me, right? Everything was a scrap after that. So when I got older, I thought I was a tough guy. And then I get into policing. I got 6 months on the job. Long story short, I get in a full out fight with a real bad guy. And I remember hitting him as hard as I could, and he took it. And he hit me back, and he blew up my nose, and he hit it hard. And I had in a long time, that was the first other tough guy I'd come across. And we ended up winning the fight. But it was after that I'm like, man, I got to learn how to do something like this. Just being tough's not going to do it. This guy put the pipes to me, beat me up pretty good. I mean, he lost, but I was hurting for a little bit. And that got me into wrestling, which got me into submission grappling, which got me into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, judo, wrestling, boxing, Muay Thai. And then I wrapped it all up because I surrounded myself by the best people, and I got into it. And the funny thing is, once I started training, I never had an issue since. It's just, I don't know. I guess I walk up and people see the nose and they say, yeah, you know what? I think I'll pass here. But all that's part of policing, right? It's part of being prepared to do things. The reason why I've never shot anybody, the reason why I've never used my taser, I've never used my baton, I've never used pepper spray, is because I'm okay with two things. I'm good with my hands, but most importantly, I'm good with my mouth. Right? When you've really been in punch ups and you've been on the losing end of it, you really value not going there right off of the get go. Right. So you really come in a little bit more calm. And trust me, as much as I love to fight and I'm good at it, it's the very last thing I ever do. It's absolutely the last thing because one, I don't want to hurt anybody. Two, I don't want to get hurt. And three, you never know when you're going to come across a tough guy who knows a little bit more than you. So I've always chased sports. I've always competed at really aggressive things. I wanted to really put myself to the test. And I've always taken shots on myself. I don't ever do that. You know, sometimes you'll see motivational people, and I'm not a motivational guy. I'm just telling you, I'll see these things and I'll be like, chase your dreams. Look, man, I do that. I absolutely go after things that I think sometimes are like, there's no way I'm going to get this. And you know what? I fail at a lot of the things, but then the things I do win at, I win at big. And every time you walk away, you lose something, you lose. But when you win, you win big. But it's about kind of swinging for the stars and seeing where he ends up. And you know, Frank, even with stuff like this, the reason I do these type of things with you guys and girls is because I believe so much in a solution for this. And we do have the solution, but it's really going to take new minds to bring it together. The way I see myself in the solution is I've done the legwork. I know what works at the very basic level, the very human to human level, but I can't do it all. So I need to plant seeds in people like yourself that are going to be in different organizations to connect you with the bigger cause being, how do we all get on the same page here, regardless of political affiliation or your thoughts, but with the same page of how do we fix this problem? And it's absolutely fixable. We just need to have people willing to come to the table, willing to put skin in the game, and willing to fight for the right thing to do. And this is absolutely the right thing to do. I mean, we're looking at, you know, dealing with not only the crime thing, but you know, ending generational poverty, creating economic development, creating new businesses, really pushing people to chase their dreams. And this is dreams we're talking about. We're not talking about, oh, this is a goal of mine. No, for a lot of these people, we can push them towards their dreams, but it's going to take people from every organization that are really open-minded to say, yeah, we should look at different venues of education, for example. You know, why is it okay that 5% of the general education population doesn't adopt to it and we just consider it a write-off and they end up being, you know, the poorest off in society? Education needs to be adjusted to help these people connect to something that connects with them, as well as different economic opportunities. And I'm a big believer in government has to be a little bit more hands off. You know, we want to supplement every problem for everybody because we think it's the right thing to do. I can't fix all of your problems. I can't solve it to you. I can't attach you to a baby bottle and say, here for the rest of your life. The government really needs to get really aggressive in their initiative to start giving people the education and the tools, the know-how and the networks to succeed on their own, whatever that means, as long as it's not criminally or hurting anybody. I really feel like the one thing I took back from all of this, that's the real motivating factor for me, is it has to be less government involvement in the way that it's involvement and more education and tools and pushing people to have success on their own terms. I think it's the right thing to do. Sorry, Frank, I hope that sums up kind of.
No, that's awesome, and I just wanted to get. I want the students to feel the same thing I feel every time I listen to you. He's very motivational and very inspirational, and you can tell that just didn't grow. He didn't get that at school, right? He just didn't show up at school and learn all this. He had it right from the ground up, and I think that's a beautiful testament to real life and real living. And it's too bad. I haven't asked him in a while whether or not he's still, because he's too busy. I know that. He's all over television. But if you had a studio and you provide these kind of self-defense techniques, I'm sure you have a lot of people in this class that would be interested, Ron. And also, I'll shut up now because I know maybe some of the students might want to ask specific questions. So please go ahead. It's open floor.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Ask any question, I'll tell you. For those of you who want to get into self-defense, if you follow my social media, all the gyms I've gone to, I'm going back there now to support small business. So I'm going back there to say, look, if you want to see where I've been and who I've been with, just follow me. I always give the businesses I go to a shout out. I'm big on supporting small business and local economic development because I believe in the cause. And like I said, for those of you who are kind of lost and confused, look, I don't know what to tell you. All I can tell you is through putting in the time and the garbage work, being the stuff I didn't want to do, and attaching myself to a solution. And trust me, the reason I guess, sometimes I'll tell people, they'll say, you're passionate about this. I'm passionate, but you know what else I am? I'm frustrated. I'm so frustrated by this because it's such a simple solution in my mind to solve so many problems, that having to constantly pitch this, I'm just passionate about that part, to say there is a real end here. Everybody wants to help people. And I think it's so important. And I'll tell you, Frank, you could, relate to this as being a police officer, because the other part of being a police officer is you see the worst of everything. All right. That's the reality to it all the time. Nobody ever calls the police when we have extra birthday cake. Doesn't exist, right? They only call us for the terrible things. And recently, the number of suicides and domestic violence calls we get daily is astronomical. I've never seen it like this. I mean, I think I went to 6 suicide calls in one day. 5 were attempted, 1 was successful. But in all of those, I'm seeing some commonalities there too. And some of the commonalities, and what I'll draw this into here, is I had dealt with years ago, and it stuck with me. And I'll share this with you because it was really a big piece that kind of etched in stone in my brain. I was dealing with somebody who was on their deathbed. They were going to die, and it was a awkward situation, but this person was completely at peace with it for their own reasons. And I remember in that conversation, they had said something to me which really stuck with me. And they had said, you die twice in this world. The first time you die is when you physically die, and we have limited to no control over that. Something can happen to you, old age, disease, you can pass away. I mean, you can do things, but that's the first time you die. And he said the second time you die is the last time somebody says your name. And that for me just really lit up a whole part of my brain that said, oh, that I have control over. And the more people I've been around, the more people I speak to, all of those people that I've really grown to admire and that I look up to, they've all attached themselves into some altruistic cause that they really believe in. They really want to help the world, whatever way that they can. They really want to leave a lasting impression. And I drew a lot of motivation from that. So I'm consistently reminded, because I got that banner floating in the front of my face, is look, you absolutely have control the second time you die, being the last time somebody says your name. Now it's, what are you going to do in the short amount of time that we have here to be able to do something about it? And for me, where I found it was, look, I'm good at talking. I'm good at problem solving. I'm good at the big picture, being the vision, but I really need to plant seeds in other people and be okay with them growing it the way that they want to grow into. So I have complete flexibility in how the solution is put in, but I want champions to be able to drive that going forward. And for people, regardless of what lane you pick, to do it to the best of your ability. I don't care what it is. Even defense lawyers, I'm friends with them, and I'm like, look, you should be the best defense lawyer you have, because they create the fairest system that we need to hold people to the highest of standards. But also, whatever lane you're in, if you're in social services, corrections, I don't care. Just do your job to the best of your ability, because at the end of it, you're going to live forever if you can do it well enough.
Excellent. Randy Porrick, Gladys, an interesting story. She's you heard her from the very first person you selected to introduce Ron. She's I'm sorry, one of the southern countries. She's been here like 2 months. This is her speaking English with like 2 months. It's amazing. And has her master's degree, is involved in justice, like prosecutions and all that, and a really nice person. But I know she didn't get a chance to actually say, what your choice is, and I think it was a bit of a language barrier there. But that's where she comes from. And we also have a lot of great people in this class. They're all enthused about, making positive changes. So please go ahead, ask any question you want. This is your chance. You don't get someone like Ron Chhinzer anytime. This is difficult to actually get and select them. I have to work months. You did this in a week, but normally you have to work months ahead to try and get him to even admit that he might have some time.
Listen, Frank, you've been such a great help to me. And, for certain people, Frank, yourself included, whenever I get that email or text message, I'll free up time for guys like you, because honestly, like I said to other people, you've been a great source for me. And finding people like that around, you gotta log on to those people, man. That's for everybody to say, look, whatever they need something, you give to them as best as you can. And one of my friends, he's I took this from him, and this is the benefit. Before we go to the breakout, I think it's important to share. I met amazing people. I mean, there's people I would have never ever met in my life if I didn't attach myself to a cause. And the people I met are in some major companies. You're talking Google, major companies, high valued people. And the people that I've met, what I found is the commonality is they're all about giving. And I've really adopted that. So wherever I can give back to guys like yourself, Frank, I'm always in.
Thank you, sir. That's wonderful.
Hi, Ron. How are you? I just have a question there. When you joined the Toronto Police Force, and you said you were there for 10 years or so, in relation to how did you go to all these different sections? Is it that you shone, or was it that your superior officer thought that you were good to go to this section or not?
Yeah, so I was in Toronto for 15 years, and in those 15 years, my first 10, I'd worked in 10 different units, and a lot of it had to do with just work ethic. All right, so and that's not something I just didn't know how else to work. All right, my dad was immigrant to Canada, had no education. My mom was really educated, but her education wasn't valued here when she came in the 70s. So my parents were all about hard work. Growing up, my first job was at like 13, and if even in the summer months, if I had an off day, my dad would lose his mind. You got to pick up a second job. So we just worked hard coming in. And when I came into policing, I just had that same work ethic. And you'll find in policing, if you really want to move around, there's a couple things that you need to take into consideration. The first thing you need to take into consideration is playing well in the sandbox. All right, and that's huge for any organization or any team. It's like if you've played any high level sports, you got to fit in the team, and the fit in the team means you have to play a valuable part. Nobody on a team is looking for ego. Nobody's looking for somebody who keeps secrets. Nobody's looking for somebody who doesn't want to do the garbage stuff. In policing, the way you really get into the team is you come in with a positive attitude and you volunteer for garbage things. All right, that's the big thing at the very onset is you always put your hand up for garbage details is what we call them. So if there's somebody to have to search a dumpster or there's a crime scene and you're the most junior guy or girl, you put your hand up for that and you volunteer happily. You don't complain. You just put your hand up and say, I'll do it. And what that shows them is you're willing to put in your dues. So you kind of do all those garbage things as much as you can at the very onset. You get to know everybody, sit back, relax, take everybody in. And then the second part of that is you have to know your job really well. You have to know it. Sometimes what I've seen now is because I'm on a younger shift or I'm back on patrol on the front line, you have people coming in with a solid educational background. So they see the really big picture, but they don't want to take any time to relearn things. So they come in with really well education, but they come into the front line and they're like, well, the book says this. Well, we're not in the book anymore. Now we're in a real life situation. And it's really good to take guidance from senior officers or experienced people and ask questions. There is no such thing as a stupid question there. And it's a reality. I mean, people are going to make fun of you because that's the nature of the beast. That's policing. We have to lighten it up. So when you do ask questions, you don't take anything too serious, but you're better off asking a question than screwing up an entire investigation. So it's really being open-minded. So get along with everybody, volunteer to do the garbage stuff, really know your job well. The only way you're going to know how to do it well is by talking to people. The other thing is perform. It's about performance. It isn't just about your social circle. So for me, when I first came in, I didn't necessarily have like a super strong social circle in policing. I only connected with a few people initially that I'd worked with, but the one thing that was undeniable was my work. So I was always pushing it to find the criminals. I'd always had good investigations, and in some things, for example, I'll give you the opposite advice that I got. So when I was a kid in school, my favorite teacher was my English teacher, and I would write all these essays, and English was always a strong point for me. So I'd use all these big words in my essays, and he would say, he brought me in one day. He's like, "Look, Ron, you got to stop using big words." He goes, "The art to being smart in English is not making little things big, it's making big things little." And I was like, oh, okay, I got it. He gave me that great advice. So I try to simplify things as much as possible. Now in policing, it's a little bit of the reverse. The policing, what you'll find is cops want to take big things and make it really small, right? They get a shooting scene, they'll see shell casings and they'll say, well, there's no video, there's no witnesses. So yeah, it's a big thing, but we got nothing, we're going to close it down. In policing, it's the opposite. You want to take a small thing and make it a big thing in investigations wise. You want to be able to take that scene and make that into something. You want to find a suspect. You want to write search warrants, find people, canvas. And how you do that is the garbage stuff that nobody wants to do. You want to knock on doors, talk to people, show up on your downtime. If you're working on the front streets and you go, you know what, there's a shooting there, we had no witnesses. I'm going to come back a week later. I'm going to knock on doors. that in itself will create a great reputation for you, not just internally, but externally. And people forget about that. It's, we think in policing, it's a silo operation, right? If you're a cop and you want to really move around, it isn't the people you know on the inside that matters to a point. It's who knows you on the outside. It's who in the community, in the neighborhoods knows you and likes you, because that's what you need. You need information. Every major unit that we have in Toronto Police and any policing organization, the guns and gangs, the drug squad, the hold up squad, very rarely does a frontline officer prepare a report and then that leads to something. You need informants and friendly people on the street that are willing to tell you things. So the better you're received on the street, the more valuable you are. And how they'll know about you is there'll be a homicide in an area. They'll do the homicide, will do their canvas, and somebody will tell them and say, look, man, you know what? I don't feel comfortable talking to you, but I know Officer Ron. And then they'll say that to 4 or 5 people. Homicide will come back and say, hey, who's Ron? And then, you might have 2 years on the job, which is what happened to me. But I had so many inroads in some of these communities. It wasn't because I was like out there doing basketball, and I had arrested a lot of the bad guys, but I treated them with respect and fairness. And even when I was with people, I was always fair to them. I mean, sometimes you had to get rough with them. Sometimes it wasn't the ideal way, but at least they appreciated that I wasn't going to screw them and I was just doing my job. And I never made it personal with people. And that stood for me a lot more than other things. So to summarize, like I've already given you 3 tips. 1 is volunteer to do all the stupid stuff, all the stuff that you don't want to do. Number 2 is ask questions. And number 3 is really develop a reputation for you externally. That's not based on them liking you and feeling like, oh, he eats with my kids. No. That they respect you as a police officer, that they said, this guy fulfills a certain function in my community and he's fair. Because what they want to be able to do is they want to be able to tell you stuff about things that are happening in the neighborhood and see immediate action. They don't want you to tell you and then all of a sudden you show up with a box of clothing. They want a safe community. So those 3 are the big things I'd recommend, because those have worked for me. And I should add the 4th one. I'm a professional, internal and externally. So I don't break that. Like, I have my friends and you joke around with them, but when it's time to perform on the inside, I pride myself on being an absolute professional in how I dress, how I look, how I present things at the table with senior officers. Like, if Frank was a very high ranking senior officer, so if I had any interaction with him, I'd want to make sure that I looked the part. My uniform was prim and proper. I was clean shaven. My paperwork wasn't sloppy. I would over prepare for any interaction. If I were to meet Frank, and Frank, you were staff super, correct? And if I were to meet staff super, I would have probably, if we were going to have a 5-minute conversation, for me, in reality, I probably would have spent an hour prepping for that 5-minute conversation, knowing that I'll probably say 3 lines, because I know those 3 lines I'm going to say have to be straight to the point and impactful, because guys like Frank don't have the time. So they want to be able to rely on go-to guys as well. So keep in mind, the bosses aren't looking for superstars. They want reliable people, right? They want people who aren't going to get them into shit, that people who aren't going to cause problems, that people who aren't going to get complaints, but people who are professional and know how to get the job done. I hope that answered your question in a long-winded way.
It did. Thank you very much.
Gladys.
Sorry about that. Gladys has her hand up. Go ahead.
Okay, I enjoy this class because it's a huge opportunity for all, in special, in my case, I'm from Colombia, and I learning about the job officers, police, and I have a question. I think the people in general have stereotypes about the war with the sexual offenders. For example, what is your suggestion for an experiment officer police to amateur police, and about emotionally involved with these cases, for example, or other cases?
Yeah, it's tough when you're talking about those type of like sexual offenses and kind of what police or any law enforcement can do to both catch the people doing this as well as deal with the victims. It's really difficult, but what I like to do is exactly what I said before. I take big things and I try to make it small. And realistically, because these type of problems are so complicated, so if you think of, okay, well, there's a victim and they get sexually assaulted, and there was another branch where they don't want to talk to people and they might have been a victim. Oh, also person who did it to them might have also been sexually molested, and it tends to be the cycle. I try to just bring it back as simple as possible and say to myself, well, what can I do here that's within my skill set and my strengths? Now, for me, my strengths has always been connecting with people, building a relationship. So that's the part I stick to. So I'll connect with people, build a relationship, but then I'll find other people that are experts in certain things. So part of the gang exit stuff is we had a really strong relationship with the CAMH, which is the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, as well as a couple of other agencies that are Yorktown Family Services and John Howard Society. And what I do is I would work my part really well. So I recommend everybody's kind of finding what your own individual superpower is and find out where it fits in that complicated pattern. So if I know, okay, I fit in this part, which is the very front end of it, let me meet the people, let me talk to them, let me develop a relationship, let me find out what the problems are. Well, the other thing is I take those same skills and I build partnerships. So I build a network of people, a network of friends where guys like Frank, where, whatever they need, I'll give. I don't just take in these relationships, right? It's almost like social currency. So I'll constantly give, and I don't really ask for much ever, but when I do ask, they're so responsive that it makes things quick. So then if I'm dealing with somebody, I realize, oh, here are all your problems and you're talking about emotionally. Well, I don't have any background in any sort of psychology work or anything besides life experience and reading a bunch of books and talking to experts. But I'm not the right person. I need a psychologist or a psychiatrist or even a counselor at some points, but I know a bunch of them. So what I'll do is I'll utilize my relationship skills with people to get them to come in that want to talk to me. I'll develop some trust, and then I'll introduce them to people that I trust. And when I introduce them, we share information. And that's a huge part of it is how do you share information without crossing professional lines? So I don't want to include my own opinion into things. So what I'll say is, look, I spoke to this person. This is what they revealed to me. Also in the conversation, this is what I found they responded to, and this is what they didn't respond to. So in some cases, when you're dealing with people that are victims of sexual assault and violence, they don't want to talk in particular about what happened, but they want to talk about how they felt. And that's okay. I'll talk to them about how they felt. And I can say, look, here's a rough idea of what I think happened or the information revealed to me, but this is how they're feeling about things going forward. And I'll relay that to a professional because when it comes down to sexual offenses, it's a very intimate and violating thing for people. And if they're not comfortable sharing with me, regardless of I'm not going to pry. All right, it's on their time because I want to build that trust and that relationship. It's sometimes people in our industry really are pushing for something else because our goal is different. Our goal is catch the bad guy. But when we're with these people, we need to take into consideration that they're going to be with us for 3 or 4 years until the court process is done. And I don't want them to feel re-victimized in the process. So policing has really taken in a real proactive step. So for domestic violence cases and sexual assault and violence cases, the first responding officer who goes there doesn't get into the details. They just get enough to, hey, what happened here? The person might say, I was raped. I was sexually assaulted. This person did stuff to me. I don't like it. And as soon as we hear that, we say, perfect. Are you okay? Do you need to go to a hospital? Is there anybody you want to talk to? But we're going to call a specialized investigator. And we have specific courses for officers that have to take that have to be able to do these investigations for domestic violence, sexual assault, and anything to do with children involved in either of those things. So what we do is we get the bare bones. We make sure physically they're okay. Do they need immediate medical attention? Is there any evidence at the scene that we need to collect? And then we take them over in a real soft approach to a seasoned or specially trained investigator who oftentimes now in the idea of partnerships, those units are now merged with Children's Aid Society. They're also merged with family and well-being units. So they have like this real wraparound approach. So my advice to anybody in that space is, don't pry too much, build that trust, because not asking questions and knowing all the details actually makes you a little bit more of a reliable person, because people don't feel pressured in the conversation to tell you things I don't want to tell you. So I'm okay waiting for tomorrow. And it takes a bit of a patience approach to it. So even on the streets, when you're dealing with people, and we do this routinely, and it's a whole separate topic I could talk to you about, but we had done 30 town halls in 30 of the most worst neighborhoods in Toronto. And we wanted to find out why things like this were happening, why people weren't telling the police. And, we got to understand that every interaction, so all of us who are going to be employed in this space, keep it in this framework. Everybody we deal with professionally, it's a paid interaction for our end. We're paid to be there. Okay. So we're being paid to be there to provide a service or be a public servant to people. To them, that's their personal life. That's not paid time. That's not a job. That's their actual life. So with us, we have to be able to apply that patience to them and say, look, I understand here that this is paid for me to do. And while we're looking at it through the lens of work and finding people, to them, this is absolutely real life. And if they've picked up that phone and called 911 or said they're willing to talk, you have to almost put yourself in their shoes and say, okay, well, this isn't the first time it happened, but this is the time it happened to the point where they thought, look, I'm now going to say something to somebody. And we don't want to break that and make them regret that they did that. So we have to really be cognizant of what space of comfort level is this person in? What am I pushing too far? And what am I not pushing enough? And it's a difficult thing to do, but it's really paying attention to body cues, social cues, are they looking down? Are they looking up? And then the process to kind of saying, okay, well, where's this person at? And the only way to get good at that is to actually do the work, actually get out there and talk to people. That's the only way. Somebody will ask me whenever I do these public speaking events, they say, how do you get good at public speaking and speech writing or whatever? I say, well, you have to do it. There's no other way to do it. There's no course I could teach you. I don't know. I just did it so much that it became comfortable for me. And the same thing with dealing with people that are victims of sexual violence. You're going to find your own way. The one other tip I'll give you, and this is for every profession, but especially law enforcement and any type of work with criminal justice, I call it R&D. So R&D in the corporate world means research and develop. Well, in policing, what I like to call it is rob and duplicate. So I will partner up with people who I think are better at me than things. And when I see them do something that I'm like, holy cow, I could do that. I like it. I take it as mine. So I'm constantly stealing techniques, ideas, conversations from everybody else. I'm just working with really good people or people I've worked with in the past. And I'll know immediately, oh, this technique, this style, I could do this. I like how they introed it. And I'm constantly R&Ding, robbing and duplicating. So I'll always find professionals in the field, really good people I look up to, and I'll sit in and I'll be the number two for them. So if we have something, I won't always step in as the number one because I want to see. It's really selfish way to look at things, but it's worked for me so well. So I like to kind of platform other people, take from them. I'll give them their credit, right? And say, yeah, I got this idea from so-and-so. But for me, that's been the most effective outside of people who want to read these books, and it's good for putting things into containers. But there's nothing like finding somebody who's been doing this for 20 years. They got this art to them. They got this just the silky smooth way of doing it. And for me, that's been the most beneficial is finding people who are good at it and being a student to them.
Thank you.
Great question and phenomenal answer as usual. I know we're getting past our time, and I just want you to be aware of it because I don't want other teachers to blame Frank for students being away from their class because they normally do. I understand, Randy, was that your hand up I saw?
That's okay. That's okay. Well, Ron, I'm sure Ron will be back next time.
Yeah, I would count on it. He's a very special guy, not our.
Thanks, man. If you got a question, Randy, ask me the question, brother.
Yeah, ask. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Just real quick. I was just gonna say, do you feel like, in your opinion, that policing has changed your characteristics as like a person?
100%. Anybody who tells you, when I first came in, I got terrible advice. It was good advice at the time, but as time has gone on, I was given terrible advice. The advice was you got to turn it off when you go home. Okay, that's what they tell you. Come into work, turn it on. When you go home, turn it off. Nobody can do that. That's living two lives. If you could do that, you're a sociopath. All right. So for me, as time went on, it does skew with you. It's inevitable. It's going to skew with you because the general public, all right, there's so many things happening right now with social media. One, they paint a completely inaccurate picture of what happens. They get a small snippet and everybody's a professional, right? So you're dealing with that. And then you're dealing with your friends and family who, wherever they sit politically or socially, they'll also start to sometimes either come closer to you or divide and move away from you. And then the other part too is you're constantly dealing with terrible things. And for a lot of people, like, how old are you, Randy, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm 27.
27 and you got bright white teeth, man. I got to know what your dental hygiene plan is, but 27, you're coming in a little bit more mature, but you're going to see there's nothing that's going to prepare you for this. Like absolutely nothing. There's nothing that prepares you for seeing the amount of violence and death and victimization that we go through on a daily basis. It's impossible to deal with. And even if that, you're around a hive mind, you're around an echo chamber. And that's sometimes the detriment to policing is this echo chamber, because the things that we do in our personal life, if it's negative or if it's self-destructive, well, the echo chambering of coppers, unless you have really mature seasoned cops, is it's going to support that behavior, because they're going to tell you, oh, nobody understands you. You don't get it. Nobody gets it. So it's okay to be an alcoholic. It's okay to get into drug use, or it's okay to have multiple, people in your life cheating on your spouse. It becomes part of that culture. And it takes a really strong person to step away from that. But, I had help. I had a lot of help from a lot of people. I was just in the right place at the right time. And I was surrounded by the right people where I could recognize in myself things that I didn't like, which is why I stepped back initially from Guns and Gangs. Was I was starting to turn into somebody I didn't like. I was not empathetic with people. I was very aggressive. I was very focused on one thing. And that's good. It's good to be that way in the profession that we're in. But my advice to everybody is it's going to change you. No matter what job you do, you're going to be a different guy at 27 than you are at 37. It's just the way life goes. And then, 47, you're going to be an even different guy. And that's the way it's supposed to be. You're not supposed to say the same. But in policing, it's you have to have, in my mind, a really strong mind, and you got to put effort into it. One of the things I do advocate to everybody in policing is you need to isolate and insulate in tough times. And I don't mean you stay away from everybody. What I mean is you got to isolate your mind. You got to reduce the input. So I don't go on social, even though I'm on social media quite often, I post and I ghost. I don't really go back on after I post. I don't read comments. I don't look up things that put me in a bad mood. I only stay focused on the prize, and the prize being, well, how do we solve this problem? So it's really about what input you're taking in and how much you can negate that. And if you are going through a tough time at work, being comfortable, we have great psychological benefits. Absolutely amazing. It's being comfortable enough to actually participate in that and take that help, because in policing, what happens is, and most people don't know this, is we make decisions that other people don't make all the time. Our entire day is filled with making critical decision makings that if we don't make the right decision, it has dire physical consequences. It's not like we're working at Tim Hortons and you screw up a coffee order and you get yelled at and you make a new one. Somebody can die, or we can die. And that's a reality of policing that people forget about. So when you're in there, you're making these critical decisions all the time. We got to look at what's happening in your brain, what's happening in your serotonin, your dopamine. You're redlining 24/7 a day. You're going up and down all day. So your baseline for regular behavior, it's kind of gone. So you need to reset a baseline for where you're at. But what I do tell cops is, and most people, I said, look, if you're an intense person, that's where your baseline should be, because that's where you feel most at home. If you're a naturally calm person, you be there. But for whatever reason, there's this idea, and I think it's really, pushed by social media, that everybody should just be calm and balanced and perfect. It's impossible. Just find where you sit and live there. It's going to change you for the better and for the worse. But again, my advice is, look, things always get better as long as you can put the work into it. Go see a psychologist if you don't think things are going well for you. They're psychologists for a reason. They have that experience. They really help navigate. They've been a great help for me. And I continue to see one who I've been seeing one for about 5 years. And she's been great with me. She really helped keep me straight and focused. And that's what I needed, was really a professional to do that. If you're relying on other coppers or people you look up to for that when you're in the deep critical times, it's a terrible idea, because even they don't know you're in the cycle. You got to find a professional that's outside of your industry or profession that can give you a fair, objective, educated, and experienced look and say, look, I get what you're going through, but this is how we're going to get you better. Because the other part too is cops will hear something, and not just cops, but most people, if you go to see a psychologist and and I've seen this time and time again, people will go and find a professional and they'll say, they'll get a title. You're depressed, you have anxiety, you have PTSD. And it's almost like a prison sentence for some people. They sit there and they're stuck on that title, and they're just like, well, I'm depressed. Well, and they can't move past it. And everything happens in time, but you got to get past it. Like, you have to at certain points. Where I know people that have been, absolutely victimized to the 100th degree. I know 3 of them, all human trafficking survivors, where if you knew their story, it's incredible. One is in her PhD program. One is a provincial expert who now works with the United Nations. And one just got into her master's program. And there is nobody I know that's been through anything more than these 3 women. And they've managed to push past it. Now, for me, when I look at them, I look at them as sources of motivation. To be like, look, if they can do it, I can do so much more, because I never went through what they had to go through. But it's this title. They've all were given that title, and they just said, all right, this is what I am. What do I need to do to get better from here? And it's that second part. Same thing, like problems and solutions. I can talk to you all day about the problems, but what I care more about is the solution. I can't fix the problems by myself, but I can definitely implement a solution. And it's the same thing with your brain. If you get those titles, you get the depression, anxiety, PTSD, great. We know what the problem is. You know what's even better? We know what to do, but you got to be willing to participate in that.
So that's great. I'll just, before we have one of our class peer leaders give you the formal thank you on behalf of everyone. I have another Gladys, you want to do a quick question? Go ahead, Gladys. Was that a mistake?
No, it's thank
Oh
you
yeah.
for
It was clap. Absolutely, there's no doubt that will come. Yeah. So for the class, listen. Next week we're on virtual, right? You know what that means. Please work on your assignments, etc. I want to make myself available, so I might pop in for the first 10 minutes of any class. I'll make myself available if you want to talk about absolutely anything, right? And just make sure that you get to the finish line is my biggest worry. And so we can all discuss whatever you want to discuss. Okay, it'll be open discussion, but you're asynchronous next week, which means you get to work on things you need to, especially my term paper. I'm getting a lot of emails on that, right? So it's December 6th, December 7th, actually. So having said that, I'll turn it over to you, Randy.
So hi again, Ron. I just want to say thank you for answering my question. It was beautifully said. Mr. Frank, what a specimen that you brought here today. Like really good speaker, like honestly very professional and very patient, which is definitely like, something that everybody can learn from when succeeding in their careers and stuff. So on behalf of the class, I just want to say like thank you for taking your day off to come here to speak to us and motivate us. You're honestly such an amazing person, and yeah, I know it's hard to get you, but I hope to see you again. And yeah, we all hope to see you again. So thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Well, thanks, guys, man. It's been an honor, man, and I love talking to people like yourself. And like I said, Frank, thanks for having me. Randy, thanks for that. It means a lot to me, man, honestly. And there are days when I feel super low, and I'm like, man, I'm banging my head on a wall. But being able to talk to people like you gives me so much hope that one of you are going to be able to put such a dent into something. And it's very humbling for me to be a small part of that. So thank you guys as well.